Thank you very much, Johannes, for the very kind invitation and also presentation of my sort of like history. And it's very nice to be here. Actually, I think the presentation is also very, 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 very timely, given the latest incidents and developments in Turkey in the last 2 days. We can also talk about this further in the discussion, I would say, part of our session. But in general, yes, it's very timely. And why it is timely next to this, latest incidents, I would like to actually argue that, EU-Turkey relations are at a major crossroads. Okay, there have been actually many crossroads at the contemporary history of EU-Turkey relations, because the relations have been rather, dominated by a vicious cycle of ebbs and flows. That means phases of conflict have been followed by phases of rapprochement, good neighborly relations with the EU, which were then once again followed by another period of conflict, estrangement, and dispute. So this has been sort of like the vicious cycle of EU-Turkey relations in general. But I would like to argue that this recent crossroads is the most important crossroads where EU and Turkey are finding themselves at, because of two reasons. The first reason is when compared with the past, periods of conflict are starting to last longer, while periods of, I would say, smooth relations, good neighborly relations, cooperation are without any conflict are starting to last shorter. The second reason why this is a very important crossroad for EU-Turkey relations is the fact that the relationship has been increasingly and gradually increasingly being formulated outside of the accession framework. And I will come back to that in the later presentations of the narratives, particularly in the contemporary, I would say, context. So it's actually very interesting. That's why it's very interesting to take this narrative approach. That's why actually I like the also approach of this series a lot, because in order to understand how we arrived at this particular status quo in EU-Turkey relationship, we have to take kind of a longitudinal analysis, right? We have to make use of a kind of a longitudinal analysis. And here I find actually the narrative approach quite, I would say, useful. It is an approach which is not that much being used of, I would say, in political science. It's a, I would say, increasing trend we are observing in terms of the use of narrative approach. It's much more used in the cognitive sciences, in psychology, in sociology, and so on. In political science, it is also related to the frame analysis approach we are making use of, but departing from the definition of the narrative approach, which was provided to us by the organizers, I would like to define the narratives as the way respective actors, governments, regions perceive a specific subject and its evolution over time, being bilateral relations, a region, a crisis era, etc., and the key actors, institutional mechanisms, drivers, and their very own relationship with the respective matter. So it does not only rely, or it's not only about the respective matter, but also it's how you define yourself with this respective matter, and where do you see yourself in the future in regard to the relationship with the respective matter. So when we come to the narrative approach, which I will apply to the Turkish case, I would like to map the master narratives. Of course, there will be actually dozens of narratives, right? Like competing narratives, converging narratives, complementary narratives, but I would like to focus on master narratives in different periods. I would like to make a mapping based on two criteria. The first one is, of course, the periodization of EU-Turkey relations in view of important U-turns, shifts, milestones, setbacks, etc. And the second one is the focus on interest-based or normative arguments. So what are the drivers, the key drivers of this of the evolution of this particular narratives in EU-Turkey relations. I will actually not talk that much about the theoretical framework, but why are we talking about norms and interests? Of course, because of the dichotomy we are experiencing in the study of European integration with the rational school, between the rational school and the constructive school. One is focusing more on interests, be it the security interests or issue-specific interests or the economic interest. The other one is focusing much more on norms, be it the ethical norms such as identity, subjective interpretations of life, or be it rather the moral norms, which are sort of the objective interpretations of life and principles such as liberal democratic values and so on. I will like to take a very, very brief look at the chronology. I will not go through all the points, but of course, in comparison to Romania, the chronology of EU-Turkey relationship, and particularly with a focus on Turkey's EU accession process, is a bit longer. But I would like to actually just address a particular pattern with regard to EU-Turkey relations, and particularly with a focus on Turkish accession process, especially I would say since 2006. When we look at the period between 1963, when the Ankara Association Agreement was signed, and when I asked actually my foreign scholars, when did Turkey first apply for membership, many actually give this date as the date of the application, which is wrong. Turkey first applied in actually 1987 for membership, but association agreement was an agreement to bring Turkey a bit closer to the European Union or to the European Economic Community, particularly in economic terms. So when we look at the first, I would say, 43 years of the relations between EU and Turkey, we see actually some ups and downs, but which could be actually regarded, I would say, when also compared with other candidates, quite normal. I mean, there have been some applications, a few rejections, but at the end there was a happy ending with like 1999, the approval of the candidacy, and 2004 decision to launch negotiations in 2005. When we look at the period starting with 2006 until present, we see actually or observe a different pattern. 2006, only one chapter has been opened and provisionally closed, and this is the only chapter which has been until now opened and I would say provisionally successfully closed in EU-Turkey relations. Then we see this pattern, 2006 suspension of 8 chapters by the Council of the EU because of the Cyprus conflict. And when we look at the other page, we see actually some kind of one step forward, one step backward kind of a pattern in Turkey's EU accession process. Opening of new chapters followed by unilateral vetoes of member states on other chapters, on very actually chapters of strategic importance, such as energy, security, foreign policy, macroeconomic credentials, and so on, so which are at the crux of the accession process. Then other chapters which have been opened, then other chapters which have been vetoed. So this has been actually sort of this catfight, I would say, in EU-Turkey relations and in the accession process in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. What we observe from the start of 2013 is a very clear standstill, okay? Or we could even say from the start of 2010. Only one additional chapter has been opened. 2013, after 3 years, another chapter has been opened. Then another break of 2 years. And then we see actually 2 chapters being opened, actually in the aftermath of the arrival of the refugee crisis in Europe and particularly in Germany. So we can definitely say from 2010 there is a very big standstill observed in EU-Turkey relations, slowing down of the, I would say, pace of Turkish integration. When we look at today's status quo in Turkish accession process, this I would call actually from de facto to de jure impasse. it was de facto because most of the chapters had been already blocked by some member states. There could be only 3 chapters, which could be opened by Turkey, but Ankara does not actually prefer the opening of these 3 chapters because these chapters are not at the very crux of the accession process, firstly, and secondly, in most cases of enlargement, these chapters have been opened by the candidate countries at the very last phase of the accession process. So these are not at the very crux. This was I would say, de facto impasse. What we have experienced from June 2018 on is actually almost a de jure impasse, a deadlock in Turkish accession process, because the General Affairs Council of the Council of the EU has actually endorsed or noted that Turkey has been moving further away from the European Union. Turkey's accession negotiations have therefore effectively come to a standstill, and no further chapters can be considered for opening or closing, and no further work towards the modernization of the EU-Turkey customs union is foreseen, which brings us to a, I would say, de jure impasse. So, this is actually my periodization of EU-Turkey relations and Turkish master narratives of the European Union in accordance with the key periods of the relationship. 1963 to 1987, I call it EU or European integration as economic and security provider. Then 1988, 1999, EU European integration as unconditional right for Turkey, in the eyes of Turkey. 2002 to 2005, EU European integration as democratic transformer. 2006 to 2010, EU European integration as partly unreliable player or process in the eyes of Turkey. 2011, since present, EU European integration as an ambiguous goal without a plan B. So I would like to very briefly go through all these periods and talk about their particularities. When we look at the first period, 1963 to 1987, this has been actually a period with 2 distinct developments. The first development is a very turbulent Turkish domestic political landscape marked by military coups, the emergence of the Cyprus conflict on the one hand, and on the EU side, of course, the Mediterranean enlargement. Okay? And here the main focus of Turkey, of Ankara, was rather not that much norms, the normative considerations, but rather the economic and security interest. That is why I called it EU or European integration as economic and security provider. And many actually inspiration came in the eyes of Ankara from the association agreement. Ankara actually took it for granted that the association agreement is actually a guarantor of Turkish membership in the European Union, which wasn't from a legal base, when we look at the articles, the case, because it clearly says the aim of this agreement is to promote the continuous and balanced strengthening of trade and economic relations between the parties. Article 28 says, shall Turkey fulfill all the obligations stemming from this agreement, the parties shall examine the possibility of the accession of Turkey to the community. But in the eyes of Ankara, this was a guarantee for the finalization of a path towards full membership. And also the narratives, I would say, narratives evolved within this context. It was a time when Turkey moved from a more inward-looking economy towards a more liberal, outward-looking economic model, or there were efforts to realize this endeavor. That's why EU accession of Turkey or membership was seen as a very natural extension of this relationship started with the association agreement on the one hand, but it was also demanded because of security and economic reasons. The opening, Turkey's opening to the world in both economic and security terms. There was no identity debate in that, which I find very interesting. in this period. Identity and the debates about Turkey's identity were non-existing because the European identity was regarded as a side product of the country's contribution to the security and stability of the Western Bloc at that time. And Turkey also perceived this membership, then, the potential membership, as a natural extension of the membership in the Western Alliance. One quote from a foreign affairs minister, Halefoğlu: "It would be expedient to analyze the relations between Turkey and Europe from a comprehensive perspective. As we have already stressed in other occasions, it would be impossible to regard Turkey just as an outpost of NATO. After the accession of Spain and Portugal into the European Community, Turkey remains, with the exception of Norway, as the only European NATO member state that is not a member of the community. This situation cannot last forever." So this is the first period. The second period, which I call European integration as unconditional right for Turkey. This period has experienced actually many ups and downs. The ups were the Helsinki European Council confirmation of Turkey's candidacy in 1999, but before, and also 1995 customs union signature between the EU and Turkey. But other than this, there have been also many downs. The rejection of Turkey's first application to the European Economic Community, a very big crisis between Greece and Turkey, which bring both countries to the brink of war, and 1997 Luxembourg European Council, Turkey's candidate status. But most importantly, what happened in this period, and which was not taken actually into regard by Ankara, was very clearly 1993. Copenhagen European Council, the establishment of a very clear-cut, rule-based accession criteria. At that time, Ankara did not take this very much into regard, and thought that it would be an unconditional right for Turkey to be integrated into the European Union as a natural extension of its partnership within the context of the customs union. Maybe just one quote from one member of the parliament: "On the path towards the EU, the customs union is not the start, but the end." I think this shows the narrative in a very, very clear way. And maybe one more, I would say, newspaper picture or screenshot. The former Prime Minister Tansu Çiller, when there was an agreement, an informal agreement between EU and Turkey in March 1995 about the launch of the customs union on 31st December 1995, in May, Tansu Çiller actually made a statement and said, "You didn't believe in me that there will be a customs union agreement between Turkey and the European Union, and now you will see in 3 years we are going to be the members." So EU membership as an unconditional right for Turkey. 2000 to 2005, this is when actually EU-Turkey relations and Turkish accession process took a very positive turn. Maybe two, I would say, important incidents happened. First of all, more attention paid by Ankara to the Copenhagen Criteria and its actually particularities, more dialogue and structured dialogue between the EU and Ankara at that time, which actually gave its fruits with the 2004 Istanbul European Council, which endorsed the launch of accession negotiations with Turkey. But other than this, on the part of the EU, there was also an effort to construct or reconstruct a new security vision in view of the crisis which had been experienced in the last couple of years. Many documents had been published, such as the European Security Strategy, European Neighborhood Policy, and so on. In all of them, Turkey found actually a very, very important place. So when we look, this is not the subject of the talk, I know, but when we look at the European narratives on Turkey and why Turkey was accepted as a negotiator from the start of 2005, we see actually more emphasis on security. Security as a key driver. When we look at Turkey, the picture is actually quite different. For the very first time after 20 years, actually there was a much more stable government structure when we compare it with the very short-lived governments of the past 10 to 15 years, which lasted almost only for 2 years each. Copenhagen Criteria was at the crux of Turkey's accession process. There was cross-party political, civil society, and public consensus on Turkish accession to the EU, and the salience and the attention paid to the Turkish accession case was probably the highest ever at that time, both within political circles as well as public opinion, as well as civil society representatives. So when we look at the Eurobarometers, 68% of the Turkish public indicated that becoming a member of the EU would be an advantage for Turkey, compared with Bulgaria, only 36%. One of my very good colleagues, who is also writing a chapter in one of our edited volumes, has actually also defined this period as Europe as everybody's project in Turkey. Maybe just one quote from Ali Babacan, who was the EU chief negotiator at that time and state minister for economic matters, afterwards also foreign affairs minister he became. The EU has demanded from us the Copenhagen criteria. We said, these are for us not Copenhagen but Ankara criteria. They will not lose, Turkey will not lose but win by adopting these criteria. They need to be fulfilled in order to carry our society, democratic structures, and our whole system to a much more advanced level. So this was a time period where there was clear emphasis put on normative considerations and EU as a normative transformer for Turkey. Maybe just one last table, which I had actually taken from one of my studies. Here you see actually the evolution of human rights and the protection of minorities in Turkey between 2000 and 2004. According to the European Commission progress reports, Turkey has actually made limited to significant progress in almost all indicators related to this criteria. 2006 till 2010, European integration as partly unreliable process, or the EU as a partly unreliable partner or actor, was the master narrative in the eyes of the Turkish political elite at that time. This is also the time when I first started with my speech, where I said there's this clear pattern of one step forward, one step backward. This is exactly, I would say, the period where we experienced and witnessed and observed this pattern at most. One chapter opens, another 3 chapters are blocked, another 3 chapters open, there's a secret veto on 6 chapters, and so on. So what we experience also in this period is, and I think this has been a U-turn in Turkish accession process. So when we talk about Turkey's EU accession process and its evolution and maybe the frustrations on the side of both EU and Turkey, we shouldn't just only put the blame on Turkey and Ankara. We can of course put the blame to some extent on Turkey and Ankara without any hesitation. But one of the breakpoints of Turkey's accession process has been the unilateral vetoes and their routinization on negotiation chapters which were supposed to be opened between Turkey and the EU in Turkey's EU accession process. And I think here the landmark or the biggest milestone was Nicolas Sarkozy's veto on 5 chapters, 2007, in accession talks with Turkey. It was very interesting because actually all the other member states were in favor of opening these chapters. A few days ahead of the gathering where these chapters, or some of them, should have been opened, Sarkozy openly said that I would block them because you need unanimity. And this shows actually how politicization in Turkish accession process took a new turn, okay, and how the EU anchor in Turkish reform process has gradually started to lose its significance. And Sarkozy's actually veto was only a success model or a pilot test or test case for other member states, being 2009 with Cyprus, another 6 chapters, being Germany 2013, a temporary, small temporary block on chapter 22, or be it Austria, and so on. So this has led actually to the decreasing of the normative consistency of EU's acquis conditionality, because conditionality is actually a bargaining strategy, as Schimmelpfennig and Zedelmeier puts it, of reinforcement by reward. At the end of the day, the more a candidate actually makes progress with regard to alignment with the acquis in related chapters, the more it needs to get the right in terms of progression, development or evolvement, or with regard to the talks in these chapters. And if chapters which were already actually ready to be opened, according to the screening reports of the European Commission, were not to be opened for almost 10 years until the refugee crisis, this actually indicates the normative inconsistency of EU's acquis conditionality at the end of the day. We call it sometimes also the pretense of conditionality, the collapse of the reward mechanism. Despite that, there was still some reform process ongoing. This was also actually recorded in the European Commission progress reports. But interestingly, this was a differential, selective, or slowing Europeanization or reform process, which means some reforms have been made, but not in accordance with the EU accession agenda, but rather in accordance with the domestic agenda of the key political actors. Maybe one quote which indicates the perception of the EU as a partly unreliable actor would be, especially in a period where our date of membership is not certain, without doubt, the schedule and the means with which these reforms will be undertaken remains to a great extent at the initiative of Turkey. Whenever our membership date and membership schedule becomes more concrete, at that moment we can have a common approach with the EU and exhibit a different stance regarding a schedule for reforms. Ali Babacan, again, chief negotiator at that time. Last period. 2011 until present, European integration as ambiguous goal without a plan B. Very interesting incidents happen in this period. Most of them are not related to the accession process, by the way. There have been a few chapters which have been opened after the outbreak of some crisis in Europe. So I wouldn't rather count them as a success story. Other than this, the relationship between EU and Turkey at that time focused on more transactional cooperation outside the accession framework dialogue, or the institutional framework which was already existent has been reshaped towards the realization of a dialogue from now on between the EU and Turkey, increasingly outside the accession framework based on joint interests and preferences, particularly at times of crisis. The positive EU-Turkey agenda launched in Ankara in 2012, 2013 German-Turkish strategic dialogue mechanism, 2013 again EU-Turkey readmission agreement and the visa liberalization dialogue launched. Most importantly, of course, 2015, 2016 EU-Turkey summits. There have been 3 summits, and the final one actually announced the March 2016 statement, which is also known as the EU-Turkey refugee deal. It's very interesting because this first summit, November 2015 summit, has actually made some conclusions, such as from now on there will be biannual bilateral summits each year between the EU and Turkey. There will be high-level political dialogue at the level of Mogherini and ministers and so on. The high-level economic dialogue, energy dialogue, which had been already launched, needs to be nurtured and more often realized. Customs union negotiations should be kicked off so that the customs union agreement, which is a very outdated agreement could be reformed, and so on. So these are all actually initiatives which are sort of formulated outside Turkey's accession framework. So I would say this is the emergence of a new dawn in EU-Turkey relations. It leads to thinking outside the accession box, gradually. But also one last very important actually development occurred 2018, as we already talked. June 2018, General Affairs Council decision, which says that Turkey is moving further away from Europe, and from now on, or right now, as for now, there won't be any opening or closing of any chapters, and customs union negotiations will not be launched. So as said, EU-Turkey relations in this area are increasingly and gradually increasingly formulated outside the accession box. What I find in terms of narratives very interesting is the fluctuating statements on EU membership. So Turkish political elites sometimes emphasizes other options or options other than membership, or that the membership is not maybe extremely vital, it's not the end of the world if Turkey would not become a member of the EU under its own conditions and terms. The other day, there are other narratives which sort of reiterate or re-emphasize the full commitment of Ankara to accession process. Interestingly, the same narratives right now we also find in Europe. So there is a convergence in terms of narratives, European and Turkish narratives in this era. Maybe two examples. The first example from 2012, another EU chief negotiator. We will not be a burden for the EU, but take burden from the EU. Excuse us, but we are not an ally that should be taken for granted under all circumstances. The very famous one from 2016, probably you all know, Turkey should first of all feel relaxed about the EU and not be fixated. Some may criticize me, but I express my opinion. For example, I have said, why shouldn't Turkey be in the Shanghai Five? But then again, a different competent narrative in just 2 years. Later, as Turkey, we will continue working towards our goal of full membership in the EU, the most important peace project in the European history. So there is a dichotomy between other options and the membership being not maybe very, very important, and then Turkey's strategic goal of a full membership. The same situation is also seen in European circles. Macron, January 2018, EU and Turkey should rethink this relationship, not in the framework of the EU integration process, but perhaps a cooperation partnership. Zygma Gabriel, former Vice Chancellor, if we can get a smart deal with Britain that governs relations with Europe after Brexit, it could be a model for other countries, for instance, Ukraine and Turkey. And last but not least, Han, February 2018, the EU and Turkey should focus on the development of a strategic partnership and not on accession negotiations in coming years. Maybe a few sentences in terms of concluding remarks. These narratives of the last period still exist on both the side of the EU and the side of Turkey. So they are actually not competing narratives, they are converging narratives, which I find very interesting. But there's a dichotomy actually within the narratives themselves. On the one hand, they sort of address maybe alternative partnership frameworks or options. On the other hand, they are still bound with other narratives, with other statements, to the full membership option of Turkey. So I would say that this shows that there is, on the one hand, not full commitment, both by Ankara and Brussels and other member states, to full membership. But on the other hand, both Ankara, Brussels, and other member states do not wish to have a divorce from this accession framework for now. One explanation, theoretically, could be because there is no plan B right now. Right? There is no plan B, an alternative right now, which is as good as the accession framework, which allows a continuous, at least to some extent, continuous dialogue between both parties, which also includes, to some extent, a normative aspect. Until this plan B is found, I don't think there will be any change in these narratives we have seen from 2011 on for the next few years. But in the discussion part, of course, we can talk about the emergence of new work and debates within academic circles on Plan B, what kind of models could be created, what would be the disadvantages, advantages, and so on. Thank you.